Hello, everybody. Do I have an interesting story for you today? It takes place 106 years ago in Canada. This is definitely a great whatnot. In Nova Scotia, Canada, there lies a harbor. On one side of the harbor is the town of Dartmouth. On the other is Halifax. Today, we will be focusing on the Halifax harbor. And most of what happens during this story will happen around Pier 6. Now, between 1914 and 1918, World War I was going on. During that time, Halifax Harbor became a main hub for any Ally ships bringing shipments into the U.S. In 1917, Halifax had a population of around 65,000 people. On December 3rd, 1917, the Norwegian ship, the SS Emo, sailed into port at Halifax. Now, it was only supposed to be in port for 2 days while it was refueling and getting supplies. But its coal load didn't arrive until the afternoon of the 5th. That delayed their departure until the following morning. On December 5th, the SS Mont Blanc, which was a French cargo ship, arrived in port from New York. Now, this ship was fully loaded with 276 tons of TNT, 271 tons of benzol, 68 tons of gun cotton or nitrocellulose, and 2,609 tons of picric acid, which is basically battery acid. The Mont Blanc was under orders to bring her cargo to France from New York via Halifax, while the Emo was to pick up cargo in New York for relief in Belgium. The passageway that the ships had to use to get in and out of the harbor was called the Narrows. Every ship was expected to stay to their right of the channel, and they all were expected to stay at or below a standard speed of 5 knots or 5 miles an hour while within the harbor. At around 7:30 on the morning of December 6th, the Emo was granted clearance to leave. It entered the Narrows, moving at a much higher speed than what was acceptable. And apparently this was to make up for lost time. The ship met up with the SS Clara, and the captains agreed to pass starboard to starboard. A short time later, the Emo was then forced to move closer to the Dartmouth shore after passing the tugboat Stella Maris. At 7:30 that same morning, the Mont Blanc was also granted clearance to leave. They began their trip up the Bedford Basin on the Dartmouth side of the harbor. The pilot of the Mont Blanc was Francis Mackey, and he was keeping a very watchful eye on all the ferry traffic, as well as the other small boats in the harbor. he spotted the emo when she was less than a mile away. Immediately, he became concerned that her path was going to cut off the Mont Blanc. The captain gave a short blast of his horn to indicate that he had the right of way, but he was met by 2 short blasts from the emo, which indicated that they were not going to yield their position. The captain then ordered the Mont Blanc to stop her engines and angle slightly closer to the Dartmouth side, and then afterwards he let out another whistle, and again he was met with a double whistle back. Now imagine everyone in the vicinity of the harbor hears this exchange. The other sailors that are around know that at this point a collision is imminent. It's gonna happen. But most people did not know that the Mont Blanc had all of those explosives on it. And why should they? So both ships cut their engines, but they both had too much momentum, and that was pushing them forward. The captain of the Mont Blanc couldn't ground his ship because he feared that if he did that, it would spark an explosion. So he just ordered that the ship be turned sharply to port. At this point, the 2 ships are parallel to each other. But for some unknown reason, the emo sent out 3 whistles, letting everyone know they were reversing their engines. So between the transverse thrust and the light weight of the ship, because remember, the emo did not have its load yet. It only had what it needed to get it to New York. So it was very lightweight. And because of that, when their engines started, it caused them to swing into the hull of the Mont Blanc. So a quick summary of what's already happened. 7:30 a.m. they both take off from their respective docks. By 8:45, they have crashed. Now, keep in mind that when they crashed, when they hit, they were going at an extremely low speed of 1 knot per hour. So, there wasn't a whole lot of damage done to the ships, but due to them hitting, the barrels of benzol fell over and broke open on the Mont Blanc. This quickly flooded the deck, and that overflowed into the hold. When the emo's engines kicked in, she disengaged. Metal and metal creates a spark. Well, it created a spark inside the hull of the Mont Blanc. Those sparks then ignited the vapors of the benzol, which started a fire at waterline that quickly traveled up the side of the ship. The captain, he knew that the ship was going to explode. He just knew it. But he thought it was going to be immediate. So he ordered his crew to get off the ship and just go. So they get in lifeboats and they're heading towards shore. At this point in time, the citizens of Halifax have begun to gather on the streets and around the windows and doors of buildings and homes nearby so that they can watch this great fire that has started. The lifeboats that were carrying the crew of the Mont Blanc reached the Dartmouth shore as the ship itself drifted and then beached herself at Pier 6 near the foot of Richmond Street. Now remember, the emo passed the tugboat, the Stella Maris. Well, that tugboat responded immediately by anchoring their own barges and then returning back to Pier 6 and spraying the ship with their fire hose. They quickly realized their hose, that one single hose, was not going to be enough to put the fire out. So they began to back off. They were then approached by a whaler, the HMS Highflyer, and a steam pinnace which belonged to the HMCS Niobe. Now the captains of the Niobe and the Stella Maris agreed that they would secure a line to the ship so they could pull it away from the pier to avoid catching the pier on fire. They were in the process of deciding which hawser they were going to use. And they decided that a 5-inch wasn't going to be big enough and that they needed a 10-inch. This is where it's too late. At that very point in time, the Mont Blanc exploded. It was 9:04 in the morning. The blast completely blew the ship apart and created a blast wave that radiated more than 3,300 feet per second. The blast had a temperature of 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit. A cloud of smoke rose at least 11,800 feet in the air. The blast itself was felt 129 miles away in Cape Breton. Over 400 acres was completely destroyed by the explosion, and the floor of the harbor was momentarily exposed because of the amount of water that had gotten displaced. The blast created its own tsunami, and the water rose to 60 feet above the high water mark on the Halifax side of the harbor. The tsunami carried the Emo onto the shore on the Dartmouth side. That blast killed all but one sailor on the whaler, everyone on the pinnace, and 21 of the 26 men on the Stella Maris. All but one of the Mont Blanc's crew survived. In total, over 1,600 people were killed instantly. 9,000 more were injured, with 300 of those dying within the following days. Every building within a 1.6-mile radius was destroyed, totaling 12,000 buildings. The hundreds of people that were watching the fire from windows were blinded when those windows shattered. lamps and stoves that had been overturned became the cause of several fires throughout Halifax. In the North End alone, entire city blocks burned, with residents being trapped in their homes. The factories near Pier 6 were turned to rubble, with the workers still inside, killing most of them instantly. The Royal Naval College of Canada building was also badly damaged, and several of the instructors and cadets were maimed. The Richmond railway yards and station were destroyed, killing 55 railway workers and destroying over 500 railway cars. The death toll could have been worse had it not been for Patrick Vincent Coleman. Vince Coleman and his co-worker had started to flee the area after they had been warned by a sailor about the explosives on board the burning ship. As they're leaving, Vince remembered that there was a passenger train from New Brunswick due to arrive any minute. He returned to his post and sent out urgent telegraph messages to stop the train. His last message is in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic and states, "Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." His messages were heard by other stations along the Intercolonial Railway. It helped the railway officials respond immediately. Passenger Train 10 from New Brunswick is believed to have heeded the warning and stopped a safe distance from the blast, saving around 300 railway passengers. Vince Coleman was killed at his post. Camp Hill Military Hospital admitted 1,400 victims on December 6. Firefighters came from as far as Moncton, New Brunswick, which was 160 miles away. The first fire crew to arrive was the 10-man crew of the Patricia from the West Street Station 2. Only one member of that crew would survive the day. The American steamship Old Colony was converted into a hospital ship as it was suffering very little damage from the blast. Other ships that had been in the harbor sent out search and rescue crews. A lot of survivors were rightfully dazed by the explosion and originally believed that a bomb had been dropped on the city by the Germans. As it became known what had actually occurred, residents began to show up to help with rescue efforts. Passengers on a train from St. John arrived shortly after the blast, and the passengers and soldiers aboard began using the emergency tools that they found to help dig people out of their homes. And they used the sheets from the sleeping cars as bandages. They then loaded as many wounded as they could onto that train. And that train carried them, along with a doctor, to Truro, I hope I'm saying that right. Rescue trains were dispatched from across Atlantic Canada and the northeastern U.S., carrying medical personnel and supplies. The first train was from Truro. It arrived around noon and would return around 3 p.m. with more wounded and homeless. The track became impassable near Rockingham, so in order to reach the wounded, rescue crews would have to walk through parts of the devastated city until they reached the point where the military had started to clear the streets. The following day, relief efforts were slowed significantly due to a blizzard that hit the area with 16 inches of snowfall. The trains from other parts of Canada and the U.S. were stalled, and the rescue committee was forced to suspend the search for survivors. The storm itself, however, aided with putting out the last of the fires. The official number of those killed was 1,782 people, according to the Nova Scotia Archives and Records Management. Due to the wording, though, it sounds like that was just those who were identified. With 1,600 people being killed immediately by the blast, tsunami, and buildings collapsing, 9,000 were injured. 1,630 homes were destroyed. 12,000 homes were damaged. Nearly 6,000 people were homeless, and 25,000 people had insufficient shelter. The industrial section of the city was now completely gone, with most of the workers as casualties. The last body from the explosion to be recovered was a caretaker who had been killed at the exhibition grounds. His body was found in 1919. The Chebucto Road School, now known as the Maritime Conservatory of Performing Arts, was the makeshift central morgue. If anyone has any stories of hauntings of that area, please let me know. I would love to hear them. So at the morgue, bodies started to come by truck and wagon loads. Arthur S. Barnstead took over as the morgue went into operation, implementing a system based on the same one that his father, John Henry Barnstead, developed to catalog the dead from the aftermath of the 1912 Titanic disaster. Roughly 5,900 eye injuries were reported, and 41 people lost their sight permanently due to stopping to watch the fire in front of windows. The damage was estimated to cost upwards of 35 million Canadian dollars, which today would be around $696 million. Dartmouth, while they did receive heavy damage from the blast, they were not as densely populated So they were only reporting about 100 deaths. The Nova Scotia Hospital was the only hospital in Dartmouth, and many of the victims were treated there. The This is harder to say than it looks. The Mi'kmaq community in Tufts Cove was near the center of the blast. Due to the census not being completed, because they were an indigenous people and they weren't important back then, it is unknown how many people actually perished in the explosion, but they know that they were able to find 9 bodies, and only 11 known survivors had been found. Their settlement was not rebuilt, as the government had been trying to force them onto a reservation for years. Instead, they were placed in a racially segregated building under poor conditions and then dispersed around Nova Scotia. The community of Africville was spared a direct hit from the explosion. However, the small, frail homes were heavily damaged. The families there only recorded 5 deaths. Now, between racism and a growing conviction that Africville should be demolished, the people received absolutely no police or fire protection, and they had to make do with no water mains or sewer lines, even though they paid city taxes. They also received precious little of the donated relief funds, and none of the reconstruction was invested in their area. After the cause of the collision was determined, the captain, pilot, and commander of the Mont Blanc were charged with manslaughter and criminal negligence due to the anti-French opinion of the locals. No one was ever successfully tried. My personal opinion is that the SS Emo was the one in the wrong. That boat was going way too fast, and it was on the wrong side of the harbor when they were basically told to move. They refused. The burden should have been on their captain, pilot, and commander. By late January of 1918, there were still around 5,000 people without shelter. 832 new housing units were built. The hard-hit Richmond neighborhood, previously was a working-class neighborhood, was seen as an opportunity to improve. So they built 326 large homes that each faced a tree-lined boulevard. They were built with fireproof materials called hydrostone. Once finished, the hydrostone neighborhood had homes, businesses, and parks to help create a sense of community. Today, it is an upscale shopping district. In 1994, Jay White, a Halifax historian, determined that the Halifax explosion remains unchallenged in overall magnitude when you consider the 5 criteria of casualties, force of blast, radius of devastation, quantity of explosive material, and total value property destroyed. It is still used as a comparison when explaining the strength of explosions. In one instance, Time magazine wrote the explosive power of the little boy atomic bomb during the bombing of Hiroshima was 7 times that of Halifax. Due to the traumatic nature of the explosion for the community as a whole, the city stopped commemorating it after their first anniversary. The second commemoration did not take place until the 50th anniversary in 1967. And after that, the festivities ended again. In 1964, construction began on the Halifax North Memorial Library, designed to commemorate the victims of the explosion. The library entrance features the first monument built to mark the explosion, called the Halifax Explosion Memorial Sculpture. It was created by Jordi Bonet. The sculpture was dismantled by the Halifax Regional Municipality in 2004. In 1985, the Halifax Explosion Memorial Bells were built and relocated the memorial bells from a nearby church to a large concrete sculpture on Fort Needham Hill, facing Ground Zero. The bell tower is the location of an annual civic ceremony held every December 6th. A memorial at Halifax Fire Station No. 4 on Lady Hammond Road honors the firefighters killed while responding to the explosion. Fragments of the Mont Blanc have been mounted as neighborhood monuments to the explosion at Albro Lake Road in Dartmouth, at Regatta Point, and in other spots of the area. Simple monuments mark the mass graves of explosion victims at the Fairview Lawn Cemetery and the Bears Road Cemetery. A memorial book with a list of all known names of victims is displayed at the Halifax North Memorial Library and at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, who also has the largest permanent exhibit about the explosion. That is the sad story of the Halifax explosion. It was so avoidable. And I have frustration and anger that they didn't try to rebuild the Black or Indigenous communities. I understand racism was at a peak, but still, it doesn't take much for common decency. I want to make sure that I tell you there are pictures. If you go to Britannica or Wikipedia, I know for a fact there are pictures there. This was a very heavy story, and it took me longer to write my script than normal because there was so much information and so much involved in it. And I wanted to make sure that I gave you as much information as I could, and I'm sorry if I butchered any of the names. I am terrible with that. But I do hope that you enjoyed this whatnot. If you'd like to hear more stories like this one, please feel free to reach out and let me know. On every episode on Spotify, there is a section where you can tell me how you feel about the episode. But till next time, stay true and whatnot. Talk to you later.